I'm on the phone right now with Andy No, author of the book Unmasked, Inside Antifa's Radical Plan to Destroy Democracy. As many of you may know, if you followed him on Twitter, he has been following Antifa for several years now and tracking them and talking about them and showing them to be what they really are. And we're here to talk to him and get that information from him. Thanks for joining Word on the Street, Mr. No.
Thanks for having me on.
First, before we begin, I want to start with your detractors. Everything I've read about you and your efforts to track Antifa and talk about Antifa and profile Antifa, they call you a far-right journalist, a far-right activist. Can you tell me, are you a far-right journalist, or quite simply, who did you vote for?
I am center-right. When I go and do interviews on television, I am often described as a conservative journalist, and I've come to accept that. I used to be more libertarian, but I don't think the libertarians have good answers for the preservation of culture and tradition, which are things that are important to me.
So far-right is hardly a description for you.
No, I am all about the defense of civil liberties and human rights, which is why I am so vocally critical of Antifa.
Well, let's start there. Antifa, what is it? What is Antifa? Is it a group? Is it a loose organization of people? I'm seeing people in the press start to call QAnon. There's an article that I just recently saw, an interview I saw with a young lady who said she left QAnon and a former member of QAnon. And I'm wondering what this group of QAnon that they're talking about, because I've never seen a QAnon group. I saw them as an online group of people. Is Antifa the same, or are they an organized group of people?
Well, they're certainly way more organized than what QAnon is. QAnon is some conspiracy theories that are spread online. They don't organize themselves into organizations, whereas Antifa is a network of various cells. They call them affinity groups, and some of these are more formalized than others. So Rose City Antifa, for example, which is the Antifa group in Portland, they are actually structured as a formal organization that has membership, recruitment, meeting, a whole radicalization process. I write about this in my book. There are some people who are more loosely affiliated, but the thing is, I think maybe a better way to understand Antifa is to think of them similarly to like how Islamists and jihadists organize, in that you just need to follow a similar ideology, and you can organize independently or to create your own cells just based off the same belief system.
Gotcha. So one of the parts of your book, and I'm starting with your criticisms first, and then going into the book. One of the things I saw, I think it was the L.A. Times, I believe, said the book was a book of lies. Can you tell us why someone would call your book a book of lies, but accept Omarosa's book about Trump as the solid truth?
Yes. So the person who wrote the review of Unmasked in the LA Times, the piece is full of smears against me, in terms of it doesn't really address the content of Unmasked, but rather is just ad hominem attacks against me. There's a line that says that I would do Herr Goebbels proud. There's another part that says that read this if you want to find out about Antifa. It would be similar to like learning about Kazakhstan from Borat. So lots of very unprofessional, insulting statements in there. I mean, it's no surprise that my journalism is a threat to the far left and the left. And so they don't like the idea of even this book existing, which is why even weeks ahead of this book coming out, they were trying to pressure the publisher into pulling it. People were tagging the personal social media accounts of my publisher's employees and trying to pressure them personally to get them to have an outcry. But the book is out. I think it stands. If the worst that people have are ad hominems, I'll take it.
Right. Isn't that by definition fascism, though, what they did? Isn't it what they were doing or trying to do to your publisher? Isn't that by its very definition what we would call fascism?
Well, the demand that books get banned is the contemporary book burning, and that was a feature of what the National Socialists did before World War II. So they do have that in common with the historical fascists, yes.
Let's go to Portland. You cover Portland in your book. I remember a story of a young 16-year-old getting shot in his car by the Chaz Defense Group in Portland, in Seattle. The father went on Fox News. No other media outlet covered this father, who was African American, whose son was African American, who got killed by these people in Seattle. One of two questions. The first question is, was anybody ever arrested in that case? And the second question is, wasn't this, by definition, violence at an insurrection?
Yes, it is. It was an insurrection. It is an insurrection. It's still ongoing. So the incident you're referring to, the shooting that resulted in the murder of a young black male in Seattle, that happened last summer in the autonomous zone, otherwise known as the Chaz. And that was when BLM and Antifa extremists took over 6 blocks of city territory pretty close to downtown in Seattle. I spent a week there undercover, write about this in the book. And even though the media at that time was really cheering on these militant extremists, and even though the mayor was defending what had happened and going on CNN and saying that this could be a summer of blood, I knew that, the people who took over the space, they created a hard border. So they actually had checkpoints. They said when you walk in, there were signs that said you're leaving the United States. They said they didn't recognize U.S. law. They forced the police at the police station there to evacuate. So very quickly, the situation there devolved until extortion, fights, violence, shootings, and then murders. So 2 people were killed there. And out of the 6 shootings and 2 people who were killed, only 1 person, as far as I know, has been identified as a suspect. And that's because in all the other cases, the Antifa there, immediately after the shooting, they were picking up the bullet castings. They moved the evidence around. So there was a 19-year-old man who was killed, and then there was a 16-year-old adolescent who was killed, shot in the head, allegedly by Chaz's militia security. And the police, when they came there, the car had already been ransacked by them. So that was all intentional. They don't want the truth to be known about who is responsible for the killings in there. And that's just an example of what happens when you give Antifa the space to actually, quote unquote, state build.
And this is what becomes interesting to me, because I'm sitting around. I'm on radio. I watch the news, all day long. It's my passion. It's what I do. It's what I'm paid to do. Actually, people listen to us to get their information from us. My question to you is, why does the media ignore this? Why does the media ignore Antifa as a far left group? Or are they a far left group, and then put so much emphasis on the 300 Proud Boys as if this is a nationwide group of people that we need to be concerned about?
Yes, Antifa is a far left organization, or I should say networks of organizations. There is no single Antifa group. And the media ignores them. By media, I'm referring to the legacy media, broadcast media. Other than conservative media, they are ignored because journalism has been completely dominated by leftists. And the leftists, out of either ignorance or sympathy, have given Antifa certain turn a blind eye to what they're doing, either by ignoring or not accurately reporting on what they are doing. So much of the public doesn't really understand what Antifa is, and you can see that ignorance reflected even up to like the executive level, like when Biden is describing Antifa as like merely an ideology, and that was also said by the head of the FBI. I think journalists have been myopically focusing only on the far right and exaggerating the threat of the far right, ignoring the extremism on their own side. And all of us are having to suffer as a result of that. I mean, we had riots from coast to coast last year, and in some places the riots are still ongoing, like in my hometown of Portland, Oregon. And it claimed dozens of lives. It costed billions of dollars in damages to the American economy during a time when we are having extremely high levels of unemployment because of coronavirus policies.
I'm on the phone with Andy No, author of Unmasked, Inside Antifa's Radical Plan to Destroy Democracy. You said something before, either they're ignorant or they're sympathetic, the media, talking about the media to Antifa. If they're sympathetic, doesn't that become even more dangerous than saying Fox News is sympathetic to far-right groups, which we know is not true because they talk, they criticize them as much as they criticize anybody else. But this sympathy, if the media is sympathetic to a group like Antifa, what does that bode for the future of America? Is it in the title of your book?
Yes, it is dangerous. So I actually named some names in my book about journalists who have been arrested at some of these so-called journalists who have been arrested at these riots. Even one in particular, Shane Burley, who is involved in providing secret radicalization training to the Antifa in Portland. And he's somebody who's written an opinion piece for NBC. So these extremists hide their extremism, and they do propaganda for Antifa in the mainstream press, talking about how, these are people who are anti-fascists opposing white supremacists and neo-Nazis, rather than these are people who are violent extremists who advocate for using terroristic tactics against the state as well as against other citizens. They've killed, actually. I mean, the riots last year in Portland, when they lasted for more than 120 days, and then by the end of August, one of the Antifa in Portland actually stalked a Trump supporter in downtown and then shot him pretty much at point blank with a pistol, killed him instantly, and then fled to a different state. So these are terrorists, and everybody's throwing around the T word. We're hearing a lot in the media now describing anybody who supported Trump is a terrorist. People who came to listen to Trump at the Capitol is a terrorist. And it's really rendering that word meaningless. And it's a shame because we need to have strong language to describe political movements that advocate for violence, advocate for murder in advance of their goals, property destruction, bombings. These are things that Antifa all do. And if you just read the headlines in the mainstream papers of record, all you would think are these are just anti-fascists who are opposing racists in our country.
Right. They're carrying on right now. They're doing this fraudulent impeachment, and I'm listening to them. And one of the things we wanted to ask on our show is very diverse. One of the questions: how many of the people arrested for storming the Capitol are or were Antifa?
I get asked this a lot, and that would require a lot of speculation for me to answer. And because the investigations are ongoing regarding suspects who have been charged and have pending court appointments and trials in the near future, I think if there's any evidence of other ideologies involved on what happened on the 6th of January, that will come out. it would, as a journalist, I shouldn't speculate on what I don't see evidence for.
Gotcha. So you're saying you don't see any evidence that Antifa was involved in storming the Capitol? Did I get that right?
Correct.
Gotcha. Thank you. Next question is, can someone, or how much blame, if any, can be put on an individual for inciting violence through media, publication, social media post, or a statement made publicly? Do you think that you can be blamed for these things? And as Antifa, do they drive much of their violence through tweets and social media and so forth?
Yeah, that's a great question. So right as you're asking that, I'm actually looking at what events some of the Antifa are organizing coming up. And there's an organization, an Antifa group called the Youth Liberation Front. Now, they were, the Portland chapter of their group was involved in organizing most of the riots in Portland last year that really brought my home city to its knees. They're advertising on Twitter right now this upcoming 6th of March direct action, and its words are quite clear on the flyer. It says, "Cause chaos, destroy." Now this, and there's other texts with more information. As with all the previous riots that have been organized by BLM and Antifa, they're advertised openly on Twitter and Instagram and these other big social media platforms that have given a lot of rhetoric in the media about trying to clamp down on political violence and extremism, and yet they don't really do much when it comes to far left extremists. I mean, part of what makes Antifa empowered is because they're given this legitimacy and space to operate essentially in the open. So in addition to promoting their criminal activities on Twitter through anonymous accounts, they will also open fundraising accounts on like GoFundMe, on Cash App, and Venmo, and they'll raise hundreds of thousands, millions of dollars to cover everything from riot gear to weapons to travel and accommodation and bail money.
Wow. You talk about in the book Atlanta. We had riots down here in Atlanta, a city whose tagline is the city too busy to hate. When we covered it down here, I had made, and my co-host had made certain statements on air, quite honestly, that Antifa was involved. I said it very clearly and very plainly. But couple days afterwards, people started saying the people who were rioting and looting were people taking advantage of a situation. Can you tell us that Antifa was involved in any of the rioting in Atlanta this past summer over Rayshard Brooks' shooting?
So I read about the violence that broke out in Atlanta in Unmasked. And as far as I've seen, the Antifa around the country and also in Atlanta were inciting violence among their followers on Twitter, calling for people to do things. And those statements were then retweeted by other Antifa accounts around the country. Now, I don't have hard evidence that they were involved in organizing some of the violence that had happened on the streets of the actual city, but they certainly inflamed the situation. And I know that BLM style individuals and groups did a lot in having a role in, for example, burning down the Wendy's and then creating this sort of no-go area around there where they shut off traffic, block traffic, and that was allowed to go on for a certain amount of time. They had their own people with guns who was protecting that area, and there was a child who was killed in the course of that.
Sequoia Turner. They still haven't caught her killer. That being said, I don't mean to cut you off, but that being said, should the mayor of Atlanta, under the pretext that the president is being impeached on, under that same rule of engagement, if you will, should the mayor of Atlanta be looked at as having blood on her hands because she allowed that to continue for so long?
It's not just her. Mayors of all these cities have blood on their hands, and that they turn a blind eye to extremism that's done in the so-called name of racial justice, and they allow them to do things like create lawless zones where people actually get killed.
I'm on the phone with Andy No, author of Unmasked. the how Antifa is. Let me get the correct title your sales will go through the roof, which it should. And Unmasked, Inside Antifa's Radical Plan to Destroy Democracy. Andy No is a journalist, and he's been tracking these guys for long. Probably, I would say, the expert on Antifa as an outside observer. Last question, sir. As we go into 2022, we haven't seen any riots. People have been killed by the police. We haven't seen anything. As we go into an election year next year, do you anticipate? Well, let me rephrase the question. Time magazine recently wrote an article where they talked about this cabal of business and politics and grassroots activists. Do you think they will activate Antifa, Black Lives Matter again going into an election year? And the second part of that question is Black Lives Matter part and parcel the same as Antifa?
Black Lives Matter is a separate movement, but in how they function now in the United States, they are linked to Antifa in that both of them, for now, share the same messaging. And if you go to any of these Antifa riots, you'll see banners and signs that says Black Lives Matter, and they will do the same chants. So they're fighting, you could say, for the same things in that they both have the same enemy in the United States. They are linked entities, and that partnership is important because they mutually radicalize one another. Antifa frequently acts as volunteer security for BLM, and the Antifa security person who shot and killed the Trump supporter in Portland, he was one of the BLM volunteer securities. So we should link the two because they are open about that partnership. In regards to what we can expect for next year, I think that's a bit too far ahead for me to predict, but I feel more comfortable speaking about what I think will happen for 2021. We're still new into the year. The riots in the Pacific Northwest have still continued. I mean, the Antifa in Portland, they destroyed the offices of the DNC there on Inauguration Day. They don't recognize the authority of any governing party. So all their opposition that they had against Donald Trump before, that was just pretextual and an excuse for the violence. And now that Trump's no longer there for them to blame stuff on, they're still acting in the same way. And I think all it takes really for more mass riots to break out is for another video to come out that purports to show a black person being killed by police. It doesn't matter the circumstances. People and the media will use that to incite another interaction.
But I know we had a time frame, but if I could just get this last point in, just last back and forth in, if the media is kind of sympathetic or naive to Antifa and something comes out but Joe Biden is the president, doesn't the media kind of start to pull back from pull back from pushing that narrative because they don't want the riots under Joe Biden to happen as they did under Trump? Do you see that, or is that a fair statement to make?
I think there's a lot of this hatred of the United States that you see reflected in things that journalists who work in mainstream media, what they say on their personal accounts. And so I don't think that their preference for Biden will override their desire to push certain narratives that are meant to destabilize the country that they hate.
Andy No, God bless you, brother. Author of the book. Get this book, ladies and gentlemen. Please get it. Order it. It's called Unmasked, Inside Antifa's Radical Plan to Destroy Democracy. Andy No, tell people how they can get the book.
It's sold wherever books are sold.
All right.
Yeah.
And shout out to your publisher for being brave enough to put this out. And I'm going to get my copy from Barnes & Noble this weekend. Thank you very much, my brother. God bless you. Keep up the good work. And please, please stay safe out there.
Thanks for having me on.
Bye-bye.